Hi everyone. This is the second lecture in object-oriented programming series, which is basically called as constructors, right? So if you have not checked out my last video about what an object-oriented programming is and what is classes and objects, I really recommend please go and watch that. Okay, but if you're someone who knows what classes and objects, so might be you can skip it. So basically, we said that classes and objects are basically the building blocks or the foundations on which your entire object-oriented programming languages are built, right? Like Java and C++ and C Sharp and so on, correct? So in that, we know that, classes are nothing but blueprints and your objects are nothing but the instances, okay? Or in other words, in simple terms, nothing but, the data which you have to plug in into this blueprint. So if you put in, like, let's say if I have a student class, right? And let's say I have a group of 100 students. So basically in my program, in my software, I'm going to have those student as one blueprint, like what are the information I want to capture about that student. And then I'm going to have 100 objects because now I have basically 100 different unique data for student class. Correct? Now we said that is nothing but an object. So we need to know how to construct an object, correct? So there has to be a way of constructing that objects, and that is basically called as constructors. The job of the constructors is only to construct objects for you. Okay, so in Java we do this by using a constructor, and we use a keyword which is called as new. This new keyword is going to create your object in what we call as heap memory. So your objects will be created in Java, the specific to Java will be created in heap memory using the constructors. So when you create your class, right? So when you create a class, let's say I create a class, let's say XYZ, this is the name of my class, right? And let's say I have a simple int, let's say X, this is some property which I'm trying to capture for this class XYZ, just a sample thing, right? And let's say you write a public static void main, right? And you create this object of this class and you can access X. How do you create object here? The code for this would look something like this. Let's say if it's XYZ and you say this is your object one, right? And you say new and you mention XYZ. So basically syntax is that you mention here as your class name, correct? Then you mention this again, your whatever object name you want to give, right? So object name can be thought of like as variable names. So you can give any name you like, right? So you're mentioning class name object one equal to new XYZ. Okay, let's take some realistic example. Suppose if I have class of, let's say, student. Okay, now in class student, let's say I want to actually capture two information. One is I want to know what is the name of every student, and at the same time I also want to know like what are his marks he has obtained. Might be it's a percentage of marks which I am actually interested in, right? Yeah, so these are two things which I am interested. Now if I'm going to create object of this class, the syntax when it comes to Java would look like this. He will say the student, all right, and then you have to mention the name of the object. So I'm going to say s1 equal to new student. All right, then I can have another, in student object s2 equal to new student. Okay, so if you see, this is how my object is created, right? But here we never spoke anything about constructor. In fact, in my class, I didn't even have any other syntax, right? Like I cannot pinpoint anywhere here, okay, this is what a constructor is, right? We do not do that. So how come we are able to construct objects? And I just mentioned a few minutes back that constructors is nothing but the, that entity which helps you to create your objects in your programming language, right? So here, when you write this, when you try to write the syntax for creation of your object, let's try to understand and decipher that syntax, right? What it means line by line. So if you see here, this part is basically called as the reference. Okay, it's basically a reference. This is also a reference. What do you think? Your whole life was a lie, but I know some of you already know a little bit of programming language and you'll be like, no, this is what we have always saying that it's an object. Yes, you're right. I'm not saying you're totally wrong, but if I really have to get into technical details, this is actually what we call as a reference. Your object is actually this part. This is where your actually object is getting created. This is actually your object getting created. Okay, and then you can see this after the name of the class, I have this open and close parenthesis. This is actually what your constructor is. This part, let's see if I have a different color for let's take a blue color. So this part is your constructor. right? So so many tiny details in one line, right? So when I say student S1 equal to new student S1, right? It's basically a memory reference, right? Which is pointing. What is the entire job of memory reference? Memory reference is nothing but it's basically it's a variable, okay? But instead of storing data in it, actually that variable is storing the address. It's storing the address of another memory location. Now that means like whenever I say S1, which is basically a variable, right? But it is saying that I'm saying it's a memory reference. Memory reference, why am I saying memory reference? Because let's say when you say student S1 equal to new student, actually if you're in your talking about Java language, you will be creating an object on heap memory in Java. JVM will create it in the heap memory. So there will be an object which is created. Let's say in this object, what all information I'll be having. Think about this. The class student basically has two information. One is your string name and another one is integer marks. So if I say that, let's say if I say integer marks, so I'm going to have some integer marks here and I'm going to have some string, let's say name, right? So there'll be some memory which will be required for storing my integer, right? It will be 4 bytes. If it is a string name, I hope you all know string in itself is actually a non-primitive data type, meaning this is actually going to point to another string which will be present in the string code, correct? So but then obviously you will have some space which you will be acquiring. Just let's keep it simple for now. So there'll be some space which you acquire, and let's say this is stored at an address, let's call it as A1. Now this A1, this address is stored in your memory reference. So when you say student S1 equal to new student, this new student, that object is actually created in heap memory. This S1 is basically nothing but a pointer or a reference which is pointing to that, basically the address, I mean where your object is created. This is actually how your objects work in Java. And that is why if you must have learned data types when you were learning Java language, you would know that there's something called as non-primitive data types, and object is considered as non-primitive data types. The reason is because you're not storing data directly inside your object, I mean inside your memory reference, but actually we are basically pointing, we're just storing an address, and the address is nothing but pointing to a location where an object is created. Now why do I say student type S1? Because we're pointing to a memory location which is basically storing an object of what type? Student. Because if this is of type student, because this is of type student, I'm going to say that the memory reference is also of type student, so that I know that I'm pointing to a memory reference which is of type the memory which is of type student. Okay, so this is where this is your memory reference, right? This is where your object is getting created. So now when I'm creating the object, the way your Java compiler actually knows that you have to create an object, because it says that new. This new keyword is going to tell your Java compiler that, okay, I have to create a new memory. And where do I have to create that memory? There are two ways where you can, allocate memory. One is just stacked memory and another is heap memory. So when you say new, you actually create this new memory in your something called as heap memory, or in simple terms, basically dynamically allocated memory, right? And then when you say student, it tells you that, okay, what kind of memory I want to create, right? Because it has to allocate some space. So it's saying that you have to create a type of memory of student. When you say student, it's you already have a blueprint which is of type class, right? Class student. So okay, a student object will have all this information, right? So when you you're just creating the object, right? Afterwards you're going to put values into name, put some value inside marks, right? So it's going to your compiler is smart enough to know, okay, how much memory I should be having inside for this particular object. And this constructor, right, when you have this open and closing parenthesis, though they simply look like brackets, but they have a bigger role to play, and this is whatever it's called as constructors. It is going to help you to construct your object, right? But then you have a question. We did not write anything, right? When you created this class, we did not write anything which looked like this open and closing parenthesis. The reason is because when you create a class, Java will do your job. Like Java will provide a default constructor to you. It provides something called as default constructor. So now the word default tells you that it is, even if you don't provide, it's Java's, Java compiler is going to add a default constructor to your class. And because a default constructor is always added to any class you create in Java, that is why whenever you are just by declaring a class and writing what all properties and methods you want inside the class, and you go ahead and create an object, Java is not going to complain, because Java has already done the job of adding a default constructor, which is going to help to construct your object. I hope this is clear, right? So now let's come back to and understand how does this constructor look like, right? So a constructor, you can think of constructor as basically the signature, the syntax of a constructor is very similar to that of a method, but most important distinguishing part of a method and a constructor is that constructor does not have any return type. There is no return type, not even your void. Okay, so there is no return type when it comes to constructors, right? So the difference between a method and a constructor is that constructor do not have any return type, and constructor's own entire purpose is to construct objects. All right, so now in this particular class, okay, if I had to, like, let's say I do not want to leave up to my Java compiler to add my default constructor, what I can do is I can create a constructor. So the constructor which I can say is, I can say basically student, right, open and close parenthesis, and this is a default constructor. Now as you see here, I have not added the word void or anything because if it's a constructor, there is no return type. You simply mention the name of the class, open and close parenthesis, and this you have your curly braces just mentioning the body of the constructor. Now if you want, because you're constructing an object, if you want, let's say, like when you want to create a student object, okay, might be you have a requirement that you want to give some default values, right? Might be, let's say for marks of the student, might be you want to give a default of, let's say, 10. You want to say that, okay, everybody gets a 10 as a default, marks. That is quite possible, right? So you can, how would you do that, right? There has to be a way of providing default values for the properties which you are modeling, right? I hope it makes sense, right? Because classes are nothing but you are modeling this physical and logical entities from the real world into your software. Now when you are having properties for these entities, it is quite possible that they are going to have some default values, correct? So when you have these default values, how do you provide them? You can provide them inside the constructor because you want those default values to be there when you create an object of that class. So where is the best way to put those information? Obviously in the constructor. So here I can say marks equal to 10. By doing so, what I have done is, like I have said, that whenever a constructor will be called, when is a constructor called? This constructor will be called when you're actually creating, the object. When you create an object and when you say new student, this constructor will get invoked and it is going to set the marks equal to 10, right? So now what it looks like is inside my S1, right? This S1 is going to point to my object. Might be the value, there is nothing there right now for name, but marks is going to have a value, a default value of 10. If you want to provide a default value for a name also, might be you want to say that name, if there is nothing there in name, you want to give a value as null. That then what is going to happen is you're going to have your null. And then let's say when you create S2, you're going to have another memory location which again has this default value, name equal to null and marks equal to 10. Because now in your constructor, when you're constructing the constructor, you can give these values to your properties. Okay, so do you see the power of constructor? Now because you have explicitly added this constructor, explicitly means you have went, and actually coded this constructor into your class. So Java is not going to now add a default constructor because there's already a default constructor here, right? When you have this constructor, we do not have any parameters here. It is called as a default constructor, right? So whatever you want, you can just leave it empty as it was before, not a problem. Or else you can even want to give any default values, you can do so. Okay, now what if, like when I'm creating the object, let's say I'm saying student S1 equal to new student, and while I'm creating only, might be I want to put the values inside this. I do not want to give the default values, but I know when I'm creating an object what is the name of the student and what are the basically the marks of that student. When I do so, can I say I wanted to provide something like this XYZ, and I want to say my marks might be the student has scored a perfect score and this is basically 100. Like this is what I actually want to do. If you want to do something like this, how can I do? This is basically, now you know that this is a part of your constructor, correct? If you want to do this, how should we do? We can definitely do that using constructor only, but now your constructor is parameterized, right? Because you have given parameters to your constructor, and this is the concept of a parameterized constructor, where you have provided some values to your properties of the class on which you are creating an object of. So how this is going to work is, if you're doing so, you have to now provide, now if you are writing a construct, you want to create an object like this, it's very important that you cannot rely now on your default constructor, right? Why? Because if you do not provide the constructor at all, how on earth Java compiler is going to know that what this XYZ, like when you want to say that XYZ should be associated to name, but Java compiler is not that smart enough to understand, okay, XYZ should belong to name and 100 should belong to marks, right? It does not know. You have to explicitly tell in code that please make sure when you're creating an object, give this XYZ value to the name and 100 value to the marks, right? So that means I have to create and add explicitly the parameterized constructor in my class. So this is going to look very similar, just very similar to your methods having parameters, right? So I want to have your student. Okay, so I'm going to have parameters here. So because I'm going to get some string, I can say string s and I can say integer y. Okay, and then I want that name should be given the value of s, and then I want that my marks should basically given a value of y. So this is now going to construct. So whenever now this line is getting executed, Java is going to make sure that, okay, I have to call a or look for a parameterized constructor. Parameterized constructor with one string and integer, you get this, and that is why it's going to use this constructor to construct your object. So now your S1 object is going to basically look like this. You have a value of name which is equal to XYZ, and your marks is nothing but equal to 100. All right, so this is the concept of parameterized constructor. Now what if, I do not want, I might be when you're creating a second object, right? It's possible that you do not know the, what is the name and the marks of the student. Then what do? Am I forced to actually just always use the parameterized constructor? Not at all. If you do not know what is, the values of your properties, you can simply use a default constructor. That means you can have more than one kind of constructor to construct your objects. Which constructor gets called depends upon what all parameters you are sending. That means Java is that, smart enough to understand what kind of basically constructor I should call, depending upon what other values have you given any values in the parameters or not. And if you have given values, it also depends upon what types of parameters you have given, right? When I say student s2 equal to new student, and let's say I do not know the information, I'm going to simply do this. Now this is going to make sure it's going to call the constructor, but it's going to call the default constructor. So default constructor is just a name given, okay? It's nothing but a constructor where you do not have any parameters, right? So I'm going to basically call a constructor which looks like this, right? It matches, right? And not having any kind of parameters here. So it's going to maybe call here and it's going to give value name equal to null and marks equal to 10. That means now I have two different ways of constructing an object. It all depends upon what kind of constructor I want to use. Okay, I hope this helps. Now let's go to IntelliJ and try to, create our constructors, right? So here, if you see, I have a class student, I have string name, integer marks, and integer grade. Let me add some constructors here. So let's add the first default constructor. So I have student, and let me say that, initially when you create this, I want to give the value as null, right? I want some default values. I want marks to be equal to 0. That's all. I do not know. Or instead of mark, let's give a default grade. That makes more sense. Let me say that the default grade of a student, let me assume it's a 4th grade. Right? You can give anything you like. After that, I also want to have some parameterized constructor. Like I want to give an option of that if you know the information of the properties of the class, you can straight away assign it, right? When you're constructing itself. So I can say string name, let's say integer marks. Might be I just know this two information. I don't know the information of grade. Absolutely fine, right? You can have you can only have two parameters. There is no compulsion that, let's say if you have 3 properties in the class, data members, like you have 3 data members like name, marks, and grade. I do not have to actually have a parameterized constructor which have all the 3 parameters. It's absolutely fine if you can just have 1 or 2 parameters depending upon what information you want the user to be able to construct a constructor out of, right? So I can simply say here, okay, so can you see here you have the word name, right? Now you say name, this name which has been present in my parameter, the name of that particular argument which is present in my parameter is similar to the name of my class member, right? Name. So I ideally would have done name equal to name. Does this make sense? No. How is a compiler going to understand when you say this name, is this left hand side name? Is it really the name of the argument, or are you actually saying you are calling the data member? How do I know that? You can do that by using a keyword which is called as this. All right. Now, what does this mean? This is nothing but the object, the current object which is being calling the constructor. Tell me, when can you call the constructor? When is the constructor invoked? Invoked means when is the constructor called? Constructor is called, the constructor is invoked when you are creating an object. Simple. So that means an object is calling the constructor, right, to create the objects, put in all the values and stuff, right? So then when you're doing that, so you do not know the name of the object, right? So Java has given this keyword call as this, thi as this, which tells you that what this means is whichever current object is calling my constructor, I'm using its reference. I'm saying this dot name, meaning that suppose let's say an object obj is calling the constructor. When you say obj dot name, meaning obj dot name means obj is basically an object of the class student, so dot name is going to access what, the data member of that class, right? So this dot name is going to be like basically this gets at runtime gets substituted with basically the object on which you're calling this constructor. So this dot name equal to name, and this is important because if you are going to have a scenario where your parameter name in the constructor and the name of your data member is same, then obviously you cannot have name equal to name. It does not make, I mean, that particular sentence does not have any semantic meaning. So if you want to distinguish between what are you trying to assign with, you have to use the keyword this, right? Similarly it goes here. Let's make this as m. Now this is what m. Now this m is nothing but I want to assign this integer m to my marks, right? So I can simply say marks. Now here there is no compulsion, because when I say marks, I know that this marks belongs to the data member and this m is actually my argument, right? So it is not compulsory here. But if I still give here, it's not going to be a problem. But obviously I do not need to, right? If you give it, it's okay. If you do not give it, it is still fine. This is important, or this is compulsory here, because otherwise you would not be able to distinguish between what name you're talking about. Are you talking about the parameter name, or are you talking about the data member name? So that is what is important here. So this is one of my parameterized constructor. You can have one more here. Let's say student, okay, and let's say I have string, let's say name. Let's give all the values here. Let's say integer marks, and let's say I also know the grade of the student, right? So in this case, let me just copy paste this part. So I have here, right, and the last part is this dot grade, right, equal to whatever grade this is there. So I have basically two parameterized constructor, one default constructor. Okay, so now having all this, let's do one thing, like let's try to now create objects for this class, right? So I have a public static void main here. So let's create objects here. So I'm going to say student, let's say s1 equal to new student, right? That means a default constructor. I mean, have a default values. Then I'm going to have student s2 equal to where I know the name of the student. Let's say Deepali, my name, and let's say might be it's the 12th. I mean, let's have 100. 100s have a perfect score. And that's what I could do. Now, is it complaining? So let's say why it is complaining. So it's saying new. Oh, I forgot the write the word student, right? So new student, Deepali and M. Next, I can have one more student whom I also know might be the grade of that student. So let's write S3 equal to new student, right? Let's write Vidar, and then we can have I think it's first, the order is important. Now you first want to provide information of marks and then the grade. So might be this person has around 99, and let's say the grade he belongs to is around 12. Right, so this is what. So I have created 3 objects using 3 different constructors, right? So I hope this helps. So this is the beauty of having constructors. Now let me show you one part. What if you did not include this? Let's say, I mean saying is, let's say I did not write a default constructor, because might be I have a use case which says that whoever is going to create objects for this class will always have information either of name and marks, or will have information of all the properties, right? So I am only interested in having 2 constructors. Then why should I provide a default constructor? Because the word default constructor means Java compiler is going to add it for me, correct? So let's try to now create this, right? Can you see here? It's already complaining. Cannot resolve constructor student. Why? It did not did that when we actually created a simple, classes and objects, right? When you do not have parameterized constructor. Why did it do that? The reason is, the moment you add parameterized constructors in your Java class, Java compiler will never add default constructor, because now Java compiler is like, okay, you have taken matters in your own hands and you are writing constructors, right? So if you're writing constructor, now it's your responsibility to go ahead and provide a default constructor. Might be do not want to provide default values, it's completely fine, but you have to go ahead and actually provide a default constructor. If you do not do so, it is going to complain, because if you have not, that means you have not included this constructor. Okay, because Java compiler is also not done that for you, and at runtime you're saying that you want this kind of constructor to construct the object. How will the compiler will be able to construct, right? So because it doesn't, so please, this is actually an interview question. The question goes, suppose in your Java class, if you have parameterized constructor, all right, and let's say I have two parameterized constructors, the only constructors I have in my class, and when I'm going and creating objects, I want to create an object using default constructor. Will you get an error? And the answer is yes, absolutely, you will get an error, because the default constructor will now not be added by the compiler, because you already have a parameterized constructors added. It is now your job as a programmer to explicitly go and create a default constructor. All right, I hope this helps.